She gave her maiden name at the door. "Miss Crawford," she said to the housekeeper who opened the servants' entrance at Thornbury Hall on a Tuesday morning in October. "I have come about the governess position." The housekeeper, Mrs. Dalton, as Isabel would later learn, looked at her with the professional assessment of a woman who had interviewed 11 governesses in 2 years and had stopped expecting to be impressed. She saw a woman of 26 in a dark wool traveling dress that had been good once and was now merely clean. She saw hands that were steady and a face that was composed and a valise that was small enough to suggest that its owner did not possess much or had left most of what she possessed behind. "You have references," Mrs. Dalton said. "I have a letter from Mrs. Pendleton of Guilford, in whose household I was employed for 8 months until the family removed to India, and a letter from the Reverend Crawford of Cheltenham, who is my father." "A clergyman's daughter?" "Yes." Mrs. Dalton studied her a moment longer, the particular study of a woman deciding whether this applicant was worth the Duke's time, and then she opened the door wider and said, "Come in. His Grace will see you at 11. Isabel stepped into the servants' corridor of Thornbury Hall and felt the walls close around her like the pages of a book she had read before and sworn never to open again. She had been here once, 3 years ago on a night in December, when Thomas had brought her through this same corridor, not the servants' entrance then, but the side door near the stables, because Thomas never used front doors when side doors were available, and because he was bringing her to meet his home without his family's knowledge, which was how Thomas did everything, sideways, in secret, with the conspiratorial delight of a man who believed that rules existed primarily to make breaking them more interesting. Thomas Everett had been the younger brother of the Duke of Thornbury. He had been 24 when she met him, 25 when he married her in a chapel in Cheltenham with only her father and the chapel warden as witnesses, and 26 when he died of a fever in Lisbon, where he had gone to pursue a business venture that he described in his letters as promising, and which Isabel later learned had been neither a business nor a venture, but a debt, owed to a man whose name Thomas never mentioned and whose patience had expired in ways that made Lisbon necessary and return impossible. Thomas had been charming and reckless and generous and irresponsible, and Isabel had loved him in the particular way that sensible women love reckless men, completely, furiously, and with the constant background awareness that the thing she loved was also the thing that would destroy her. It had destroyed her. Not dramatically, not in the way of novels with a single catastrophic event that changed everything, but slowly, through the accumulation of small disasters that Thomas left in his wake like a ship leaving debris. The debts, the creditors, the letters from Portugal that grew shorter and less coherent. The final letter, not from Thomas but from a British consul in Lisbon, informing Mrs. Everett that her husband had died of a fever on the 14th of March, and that his effects, a trunk containing clothing, a volume of Byron, and 6 shillings, would be forwarded at her convenience. She had returned to her father's house in Cheltenham. The Reverend Crawford, who had opposed the marriage quietly and supported his daughter through its consequences without ever saying, "I told you so," received her with the gentle, devastated relief of a man watching his child walk back through a door he had feared she would never use again. She had stayed for a year. She had taught at the parish school. She had applied for governess positions because a clergyman's pension did not stretch to support 2 adults, and because Isabel was 26 and practical and understood that grief was not a profession. She had not told the Duke of Thornbury that his brother had married. Thomas had not told him either. The brothers had been estranged for 3 years before Thomas's death, a falling out over money, over Thomas's debts, over the particular cruelty that families reserve for the members who refuse to conform. Gabriel Everett, the elder, had inherited the dukedom at 28 and had spent the subsequent years managing the estate, sitting in the House of Lords, and raising his daughter Charlotte alone after his own wife died in childbed. Thomas, the younger, had spent the same years accumulating debts and charm in roughly equal measure across the continent. They had not spoken since the argument. Gabriel did not know Thomas had married. Thomas had not told him, because telling him would have required asking for something, acceptance, money, forgiveness, and Thomas did not ask for things. He took them, or he did without them, and he never admitted that the doing without cost him anything, even to Isabel, even at the end. So Isabel came to Thornbury as Miss Crawford, because she was Miss Crawford. She had not used the name Everett since the consul's letter, partly because there was no legal record of the marriage in England, and partly because the name reminded her of everything she had lost and everything Thomas had failed to become. She came because the position was advertised in the Hampshire Gazette, and because the salary was £30 a year, and because Thornbury was in a part of the country she did not know, which meant that no one would recognize her, and because, and this was the part she did not examine too closely, the part she kept folded away in the place where she stored the things that were true but not helpful. She wanted to see the house that Thomas had described in his rare, sober moments with something that sounded, against all probability, like love. Gabriel Everett, 5th Duke of Thornbury, interviewed her in the library at 11 o'clock. He was 34. He was not what she had expected. Thomas had described his brother as rigid, humorless, and obsessed with duty, the kind of man who irons his cravat and then irons his opinions. But the man sitting behind the desk in the library was something more complicated than that. He was tired, not the fashionable tiredness of London drawing rooms, but the deep structural exhaustion of a man who had been doing everything alone for too long and had stopped noticing the weight because putting it down was not an option. His daughter, Charlotte, was 6. She was, the Duke explained, difficult. Isabel heard the word and understood it the way she understood most things about this family, not as a diagnosis, but as a confession. Charlotte was not difficult. Charlotte was a motherless child being raised by a man who loved her absolutely and understood her not at all, with the assistance of a succession of governesses who stayed long enough to discover that the girl's difficulty was intelligence combined with loneliness, and then left because intelligence combined with loneliness in a 6-year-old manifested as behavior that governesses were not trained to manage. She has dismissed 3 governesses this year, the Duke said. Dismissed is perhaps generous. She locked the second one in the schoolroom. The third resigned after Charlotte informed her in front of the vicar that her teaching methods were historically inaccurate and pedagogically unsound. Charlotte is 6. I do not know where she learned the word pedagogically. She reads, Isabel said. The Duke looked at her with the same expression Thomas had sometimes worn when Isabel said something he had not expected. A brief, surprised attention, like a man who had been looking at a wall and suddenly noticed it contained a window. She reads everything, he said. She reads things she should not be reading. She read my correspondence from the House of Lords last week and asked me at dinner why Parliament could not simply distribute the surplus grain to the parishes that needed it. She is 6. That is not a bad question. It is not a bad question. It is an excellent question. I did not have an adequate answer, which Charlotte found unsatisfying, and she told me so. At dinner, in front of Mrs. Dalton and the footman. Isabel almost smiled. She caught it before it completed itself. This was an interview, not a conversation, and she could not afford to be anything other than professional. But the Duke saw it. She knew he saw it because something shifted in his expression, the same small recalibration she had seen in Mrs. Dalton's face at the door. Miss Crawford, he said, I should tell you honestly that Charlotte will try to make you leave. She has done this with every governess. It is not personal. She has decided that governesses are temporary and therefore not worth investing in, and she tests this theory by making their lives sufficiently unpleasant that they prove her right. I am telling you this because I do not wish to waste your time or mine. I understand. Do you? Because the last woman who said, I understand, was locked in the schoolroom within a fortnight. I understand that your daughter is intelligent, lonely, and grieving a mother she cannot remember, and that she has learned to protect herself by ensuring that no one stays long enough to matter. I understand this because I have seen it before. In the parish school in Cheltenham, there was a boy named Daniel who threw his slate at every new teacher because the teacher before had left without saying goodbye. He stopped throwing slates when someone stayed. The Duke was quiet for a long moment. He looked at her, not the quick professional assessment of a man reviewing a candidate, but the longer, more careful look of a man who had heard something he needed and was trying to decide whether to trust it. When can you begin? He said. I've already begun, she said. Where is the schoolroom? Charlotte Everett was not difficult. She was extraordinary. She was 6 years old and she could read at the level of a child 3 years her senior. She had opinions about geography, history, arithmetic, and the correct way to address a duke's daughter at the breakfast table. She had dark hair like her father's and gray eyes that assessed every new person with the unsentimental precision of a banker evaluating a loan application. She looked at Isabel on the first morning and said, "How long will you stay?" "As long as I am needed." "That is what the last one said. She lasted 9 days." "I'm not the last one." Charlotte considered this. She picked up her slate. She began writing. The test, Isabel understood, had begun. It lasted 3 weeks. Charlotte tested her with silence, refusing to speak for an entire morning, which Isabel met by reading aloud from a history of England and stopping at the most interesting parts until Charlotte, unable to contain her curiosity, demanded to know what happened next. She tested her with questions, a relentless barrage of why and how and but that cannot be right that would have exhausted a lesser teacher, but which Isabel recognized as the desperate intellectual hunger of a child who had been given books but not conversation. She tested her with rudeness, a calculated sharpness delivered at breakfast in front of Mrs. Dalton that was designed to provoke a reaction. Isabel did not react. She said, "That was unkind, Charlotte. You are not an unkind person. I would appreciate it if you did not pretend to be one." Charlotte stared at her. The sharpness left her face and was replaced by something raw and unguarded, the brief, involuntary expression of a child who has been seen through and is not yet sure whether that is a threat or a relief. "No one stays," Charlotte said very quietly. "Everyone leaves." "Your mother left," Isabel said. It was a risk. She knew it was a risk, but she also knew, with the certainty of a woman who had spent a year watching a child throw slates because no one had named the thing he was afraid of, that Charlotte needed someone to say it. "She did not leave," Charlotte said. "She died. It is different." "You are right. It is different, but it feels the same when you are 6. Charlotte looked at her slate. She looked at the window. She looked back at Isabel with gray eyes that were too old for her face and too young for her pain. "Did someone leave you?" she asked. "Yes," Isabel said. "Someone left me." "Did it stop hurting?" "No, but it stopped being the only thing." Charlotte put down her slate. She walked across the schoolroom, a distance of perhaps 10 feet, which in the geography of a lonely child's world was the length of a continent, and she stood beside Isabel's chair and put her hand on Isabel's arm, with the tentative precision of a child who has not touched another person voluntarily in a very long time and is not certain the gesture will be welcome. Isabel put her hand over Charlotte's. They stayed like that for a moment. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. The Duke noticed the change before he understood its cause. Charlotte began eating breakfast. Charlotte began sleeping without nightmares. Charlotte began, for the first time in Mrs. Dalton's memory, laughing, not the performative laughter of a child who has learned that adults expect amusement, but the genuine, uncontrolled laughter of a girl who has been told something funny by someone she trusts. He watched Isabel from a distance at first, the way he watched everything at Thornbury, from the remove of a man who had built his life around observation rather than participation, because participation required vulnerability, and vulnerability required trust, and trust had been broken so thoroughly by his brother's departure that he had stopped attempting it. Then he began watching from closer. He found himself lingering in the corridor outside the schoolroom, listening to Isabel read aloud in her clear, unhurried voice. She read history and geography, and when Charlotte demanded it, adventure stories that Isabel edited on the fly to remove the parts she considered inaccurate, which Charlotte found hilarious, and which the Duke, listening through the half-open door, found unexpectedly moving. He found himself at dinner, asking about Charlotte's lessons, not the polite, obligatory questions of a father performing interest, but genuine inquiries, because Isabel's teaching had turned Charlotte into a child who came to dinner with opinions about Roman aqueducts and the trade routes of the East India Company, and these opinions required a response that was worthy of the child who held them. He found himself, one evening in November, standing in the library with a volume of Thomas's old letters in his hand, letters from Portugal, from Spain, from the various ports where Thomas had washed up during his years of exile, and thinking about Miss Crawford, who had arrived with a small valise and a clergyman's reference, and who had done in 4 weeks what 11 governesses had failed to do in 2 years. He found the marriage certificate on a Tuesday. He was not looking for it. He was looking for the deed to a tenant cottage that Fenwick the steward needed for a boundary dispute, and the deed had been misfiled in the box of Thomas's effects, the trunk that had been forwarded from Lisbon, which Gabriel had stored in the attic unopened, because opening it would have meant acknowledging that Thomas was dead, and acknowledging that Thomas was dead would have meant acknowledging that the last thing Gabriel had said to his brother was, "Do not come back," and that Thomas had obeyed. The trunk contained clothing, a volume of Byron, 6 shillings, and a certificate of marriage dated the 14th of September, 3 years ago, between Thomas James Everett and Isabel Mary Crawford, solemnized in the chapel of St. Michael's, Cheltenham, in the presence of the Reverend Arthur Crawford and Mr. William Marsh, warden. Crawford. Gabriel sat on the attic floor with the certificate in his hands and the dust of 3 years settling on his coat, and the house reassembled itself around him. Every conversation, every glance, every moment of the past 5 weeks rearranging into a pattern he should have seen and had not, because he had not been looking for it, because the idea that Thomas had married was as improbable as the idea that Thomas had done anything responsible in his entire life. She was Thomas's wife. She was Thomas's widow. She was in his house, teaching his daughter, sitting at his table, carrying the name Crawford like a shield, because the name Everett would have told him everything she had come here to hide. He did not confront her immediately. He sat in the attic for an hour, reading Thomas's letters with new eyes, the mentions of someone in Cheltenham, the oblique references to a commitment I cannot yet discuss, and he saw, in his brother's careless hand, the evidence of a secret that Thomas had kept not from malice, but from the same instinct that had governed everything Thomas did. The belief that asking for acceptance was the same as asking for permission, and that permission, once sought, could be refused. Thomas had not asked. Thomas had married a clergyman's daughter in a chapel with 2 witnesses, and he had not told his brother because his brother had told him not to come back. And so Thomas had made a life, a marriage, a wife, a love, and he had kept it apart from the family that had sent him away. And then he had died, and the wife he had kept secret had been left with nothing. Gabriel found Isabel in the schoolroom after Charlotte had gone to bed. She was marking Charlotte's work, a composition about the Roman road system that Charlotte had illustrated with a map of considerable accuracy, and she looked up when he came in and saw the certificate in his hand, and her face changed. It did not collapse. It did not crumble. It rearranged itself carefully and completely from the composed expression of a governess at work to the exposed expression of a woman whose last defense had been removed. "You found it," she said. "It was in his trunk, in the attic." "I see. You were Thomas's wife." "I was Thomas's wife. I am Thomas's widow. I am also your daughter's governess, which is the capacity in which I am employed, and which has nothing to do with— it has everything to do with it." His voice was not loud. It was the controlled quiet of a man who was holding something very large very carefully. "You came into this house under a false name. You sat at my table. You taught my daughter. You let Charlotte trust you, Charlotte, who does not trust anyone, and you did not tell me who you were." "No." "Why?" Isabel set down Charlotte's composition. She folded her hands, not the practiced fold of concealment, but the tired fold of a woman who had been carrying a secret for 5 weeks and was, in some part of herself she had not acknowledged, relieved to set it down. "Because I needed the position," she said. "Because my father's pension is £14 a year and the roof needs repair, and I cannot teach at the parish school and support us both. Because I applied to 9 households before this one and was rejected by all of them. Twice because I am a widow, and 3 times because I am too young, and 4 times because they required someone with more experience of the kind of families who can afford £30 a year for a governess." She paused. "And because I wanted to see this house. Thomas described it to me. He described the library and the grounds and the way the light comes through the east windows in the morning. He described it the way men describe places they love and cannot return to. I wanted to see it. I wanted to understand what he lost." Gabriel sat down. He sat in the small chair beside the schoolroom desk, the chair that was too small for him and that was meant for Charlotte, and he looked at this woman his brother had loved, this woman his brother had married in secret, this woman who had walked through his front door carrying the name Crawford and the weight of a grief she had never been permitted to share with the family that should have shared it, and he felt something shift in the architecture of his understanding. "He never told me," Gabriel said. "I told him not to come back, and he never told me he had married, and now he is dead, and I cannot—" His voice stopped. Not broke, stopped, the way a mechanism stops when a gear seizes, not from lack of power, but from an obstruction that will not move. He did not tell you because he was afraid you would refuse him, Isabel said quietly, and he could not bear to be refused by you. You were the person whose opinion mattered most to him in the world, and he could not risk discovering that it had not changed. It would have changed. If he had told me, if he had brought you here, I know, I told him so. He would not listen. He was... She stopped. She looked at the composition about Roman roads and at Charlotte's careful map, and at the schoolroom that smelled of chalk and candle wax and the particular sweet staleness of a room where a child had been learning. He was Thomas, she said. He was impossible and irresponsible, and he could not ask for help, and I loved him, and he died, and I am here because I did not know where else to go. The schoolroom was very quiet. Outside, the November wind moved through the trees along the drive. Inside, a duke sat in a child's chair, and a governess sat at a governess's desk, and between them lay a marriage certificate and 3 years of silence and the particular devastating waste of a family that had broken itself over pride. "Stay," Gabriel said. "As what?" "As Charlotte's governess, as my brother's widow, as yourself, Isabel, not Miss Crawford. Stay in this house that Thomas loved and let Charlotte know who you are, and let me..." He stopped again. "Let me begin to make right what I made wrong when I told him not to come back." Isabel looked at him. She looked at the certificate. She looked at Charlotte's map of Roman roads, which included a road from Thornbury to Cheltenham that did not exist, and which Charlotte had drawn, Isabel suspected, because she had heard Isabel mention Cheltenham and had wanted to build a path between the two places. "I will stay," she said, "but I have a condition." "Name it." "You will tell Charlotte the truth. Not now. She is too young for the full story, but enough. She deserves to know that her governess loved someone who grew up in this house. She deserves to know that the people who stay are not always the people who were supposed to." Gabriel nodded. He stood from the small chair. He placed the certificate on the desk between them. "Thomas was right about the light," he said, "in the east windows, in the morning. It is exactly as he described." "I know," she said. "I saw it on my first morning. I stood in the corridor and I watched it come through the glass, and I thought, he carried this with him. All the way to Lisbon, he carried the light." Gabriel left the schoolroom. He walked to his study. He sat at his desk and he looked at Thomas's letters, and he wept, not for the brother who had died, though he wept for that too, but for the brother who had married a remarkable woman in a chapel in Cheltenham and been too afraid to bring her home. The weeks that followed were a rebuilding. Isabel became Mrs. Everett to the household, a transition that Mrs. Dalton managed with the serene efficiency of a woman who had survived enough family revelations to be unsurprised by one more. The staff adjusted. Fenwick, the steward, adjusted. Charlotte, who was told a version of the truth appropriate for a 6-year-old, that her governess had been married to her Uncle Thomas, who had lived far away and died before Charlotte was born, absorbed the information with the practical equanimity of a child who had already accepted that the world was more complicated than adults pretended. "So you are my aunt," Charlotte said, in a manner of speaking. "Does that mean you will stay?" "Yes." "Good. We have not finished the Roman roads." Gabriel and Isabel did not fall in love in the way that stories described, suddenly, dramatically, with a single moment of recognition that changed everything. They fell in love the way that houses are repaired, slowly, systematically, one room at a time, with attention to the foundation and the walls and the places where the structure had been weakened by neglect. It began with Thomas. Not Thomas the absence, but Thomas the presence, the man who had existed between them, whose shadow fell across every room in Thornbury and whose ghost sat in every empty chair. Gabriel had never spoken about Thomas to anyone. The estrangement had been too complete, the guilt too sharp, the loss too absolute for the kind of conversation that healing required. But Isabel had known Thomas, had known the version of Thomas that Gabriel had never met, the married version, the version that tried, and sitting with her in the schoolroom after Charlotte was in bed, drinking tea that Mrs. Dalton brought without being asked, Gabriel found himself telling her things he had not told anyone. He told her about their childhood, about the summers at Thornbury when they had been boys, before the responsibilities and the resentments, when Thomas had been wild but not reckless, and Gabriel had been serious but not rigid, and they had explored the estate together, the woods, the river, the ruined folly on the hill that their grandfather had built as a picturesque ornament and which they had used as a fort. He told her about the day Thomas left, the argument in the library, the words he had said that he could not unsay, the sound of the front door closing, and the particular quality of the silence that followed, which was not the silence of a room that had emptied, but the silence of a house that had broken. Isabel listened. She listened the way she did everything, with full attention, without interruption, without the impulse to comfort or to fix. When he finished, she said, "He told me about the folly. He called it Castle Everett. He said you were always the general, and he was always the soldier, and he never minded because you were a better general than he would have been." Gabriel closed his eyes. "He did not hate you," she said. "I want you to know that. He was angry and he was hurt and he was too proud to come home, but he did not hate you. He talked about you more than he talked about anyone. He talked about you the way he talked about this house, as though you were something he had lost and could not stop describing." They sat in the schoolroom with the chalk dust and the candle wax and the ghost of a man who had loved them both, and the silence between them was not the silence of distance, but the silence of two people standing on either side of a grave, each holding a piece of the person buried there that the other had never seen. He began joining Charlotte's lessons. Not every day. The House of Lords required his presence 3 days a week, but on the days he was at Thornbury, he appeared in the schoolroom at 10 o'clock with a cup of tea and a question about what Charlotte was learning, and he stayed until noon, listening to Isabel teach with the same focused attention he brought to debates in the Lords. He discovered that Isabel's knowledge of history was more comprehensive than his own, that her understanding of geography was informed by Thomas's letters from abroad, and that she could explain the principles of arithmetic to a 6-year-old with a clarity that made him wish she had been his teacher, rather than the interminable Mr. Hobbs who had terrorized him at school. Charlotte noticed the change before anyone else. She said to Isabel one morning, while Gabriel was in London, "Papa is different." "Different how?" "He laughs at breakfast. He never laughed at breakfast before. Mrs. Dalton says it is because of you. Mrs. Dalton says a great many things. She says you are good for this house. She says this house has been waiting for you. I think she means Papa has been waiting for you, but Mrs. Dalton does not say things directly about Papa because she says it is not her place. Mrs. Dalton is very wise." Charlotte looked at her governess, her aunt, her uncle's widow, the woman who had arrived with a small valise and a false name and who had stayed, and she said, with the devastating clarity of a child who had spent 6 years observing adults and drawing conclusions they were not ready to hear, "Are you going to marry Papa?" Isabel set down her chalk. "That's not a question for the schoolroom." "Every question is a question for the schoolroom. You taught me that." Isabel looked at this extraordinary child, Thomas's niece, Gabriel's daughter, the girl who had locked a governess in a schoolroom and asked her father about grain distribution at dinner, and she thought, "You are the best of both of them." "I do not know," she said, "but I'm not going anywhere." "Good," Charlotte said. "We have not finished the Roman roads." He discovered other things, that she drank tea with no sugar because sugar had been too expensive during the years with Thomas, that she read at night by a single candle because she had trained herself to conserve, that she wore the same 3 dresses in rotation and mended them herself, in small, precise stitches that were invisible unless you looked closely, which Gabriel did, not because he was examining her clothing, but because he had developed the habit of looking at her closely and could not seem to stop. She discovered things about him, that he played the pianoforte badly but with genuine feeling in the drawing room after Charlotte went to bed, and that he stopped playing when he realized someone was listening, that he visited Thomas's grave in the churchyard every Sunday morning before the service, and stood there for exactly 5 minutes, which was long enough to say what needed to be said, and short enough that no one would notice, that he had kept every one of Thomas's letters, even the ones that were cruel, even the ones that blamed him, because keeping them was the only form of proximity that remained. One evening in February, she found him in the library. He was standing by the east windows, the windows Thomas had described, the ones where the morning light came through and made the spines glow gold, though it was evening now and the windows were dark, and he was holding a letter she recognized. Thomas's last letter. The one from Lisbon, the one that was shorter than all the others, the one that said, "I am sorry for everything I cost you. I am sorry I cannot be what you needed. I am sorry I never came home." Isabel stood in the doorway. She did not speak. She waited. "He wrote this 3 days before he died," Gabriel said. "He did not address it to me. He addressed it to the Duke of Thornbury. Not Gabriel, not my brother, the Duke." He turned from the window. "I did that. I made him feel that he could not use my name. He made choices too, Isabel said. He chose not to tell you about me. He chose not to come home. He chose to go to Lisbon. Those were his choices, not yours. You carry enough guilt for the things you actually did. Do not carry his as well. He looked at her across the library, and she saw in his face something that Thomas had never shown her, not because Thomas had not felt it, but because Thomas had not known how to hold still long enough for anyone to see it. Gabriel held still. Gabriel stood in the dark library by the windows his brother had loved, and he held still. And what she saw in his face was the thing that had been building between them for months, quiet and steady and patient, the way stone builds, not fast, not dramatic, but permanent. Isabel, he said. Her name, not Miss Crawford, not Mrs. Everett. Her name. Yes. I'm glad you came to this house. So am I. He proposed on a morning in March. They were in the library, the room Thomas had described to her, the room with the east windows where the light came through in the morning and made the spines of the books glow gold. Charlotte was at her lessons with a visiting music teacher, and the house was quiet. And Gabriel said, without preamble or ceremony, I would like to marry you. I am aware that this complicates everything. I am aware that you were my brother's wife, and that the world will have opinions about this that are not kind. I do not care about the world's opinions. I care about Charlotte, who needs you, and I care about you, which I did not expect and cannot help and would not change if I could. Isabel stood by the east windows. The light came through the glass and caught the side of her face, and she looked in that moment exactly as Thomas must have looked standing in this same spot, carrying the weight of something precious, uncertain whether to hold it or set it down. Thomas would have wanted this, she said. I know. He would have laughed. He would have said something terrible about the irony. He would have said, well, brother, it appears you finally did something interesting. Isabel laughed, a real laugh, startled and warm, the kind of laugh that escapes before you can catch it. And it was, Gabriel thought, the sound of the house becoming complete. They married in the chapel at Thornbury in April. Charlotte stood between them and held both their hands, and when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, she said, finally, in a tone so precisely like her father's that the entire congregation, Mrs. Dalton, Fenwick, the household staff, the Reverend Crawford, who had traveled from Cheltenham with tears already in his eyes, laughed. Their son was born the following winter. They named him Thomas. On the morning after the birth, Gabriel brought Charlotte to meet her brother. She stood at the bedside and looked at the baby with the critical assessment she brought to all new information, and she said, He has Uncle Thomas's nose. How can you tell? Gabriel asked. You never met Uncle Thomas. The portrait in the gallery, third from the left, he has the same nose. I have been comparing. She looked at Isabel. Is that all right? That he has Uncle Thomas's nose? Isabel held her son and looked at her stepdaughter and felt, in the room where the morning light came through the east windows and made the world gold, the particular fullness of a life that had been rebuilt from ruins, not restored, because the original could not be restored, but rebuilt, with different materials and a different architecture, and a foundation that was, against all probability, stronger than the one that had come before. It is exactly right, she said. If this story stayed with you, you might find the next one does too. They arrive here, like a name spoken aloud in a house that had forgotten it, whenever they are ready.